11th of September, 24th Sunday in Ordinary Time. Sermon on Luke chapter 15, verses 1 to 10, and 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 12 to 17. The parable of the lost sheep must be one of the most well-known sections of Jesus' teaching. Don't let familiarity, though, rob us of the deep significance of this story. It all started because Jesus welcomed a bunch of tax collectors and those judged to be sinners. They gathered round him to hear his teaching. And along came the Pharisees and teachers of the law, pulling sour faces and accusing Jesus of consorting with the riffraff of society. What they didn't recognise, though, was that we are all riffraff, sinners, whether we look respectable like those religious leaders or not. We all need Jesus and are in no position to judge anyone else. We do, though, don't we? Almost all of us must have a few people in our minds whom we judge to be beyond the pale, beyond help, beyond deserving. There are churches who seek to exclude those whom they deem to be sinners, forgetting that none of us is perfect without God's grace. Each of us is flawed, a failure, lost. And so the parable that Jesus told to the Pharisees is a reminder for us too. It's the story of a man who had 100 sheep, and one of them was lost. The first point to draw out of this account is that the man noticed. He cared enough about his sheep and knew each of them well enough to see that one was missing. And so straight away we realise that God, who is represented by this shepherd, is interested in each of us as individuals and cares. If one of us goes astray, he knows, and it's important to him. This shepherd also cares enough so that although he still has 99 sheep, all gathered in for the night as good sheep should be, he is concerned for the one sheep that has gone. Wandering the hills alone, it might escape danger, but the chances are that it will face predators, or perhaps become entangled in thorny weeds, or simply get hopelessly lost. And so the shepherd, who is really God himself, sets out to seek his sheep. It was most likely late evening when the shepherd gathered his flock and found one missing, and so he had the prospect of setting off in the growing darkness to scour the lonely hills. I know a little of how that shepherd felt, wandering, searching and calling. I used to have 2 Bedlington Terriers who looked remarkably like sheep, with their woolly, pale grey coats and slightly ovine faces. On occasion they got lost, chasing off after rabbit trails and vanishing like smoke amongst the trees. We lived at that time on a steep valley side with thick woodland across the river from our house. That was where my dogs loved to go, and where I used to lose them. Once they disappeared during the morning and were gone for over 3 hours. I searched the woodland and eventually discovered them once they'd had enough of running free. On another occasion, they ran off early one afternoon up the hillside, knee-deep in bilberry and heather, impossible for me. And this time they were lost for over 8 hours. I couldn't bear to go home without them, and so I searched and waited until 10 to 10 at night, when I saw them plodding back across the bridge that spanned the river. Both times it's difficult to describe the joy I felt when they were found. Even 20 years on, I still relive those wonderful moments. It was almost worth losing them in order to experience the joy of gathering them back. Thus it is that many people who have led a life which took them far from God, including some Christians who've gone astray, often experience God's joyful welcome in such measure that they become strong believers with wonderful testimonies of his love and grace. In the parable, the shepherd finds his lost sheep and carries it home on his shoulders. There's no reason why the sheep, having wandered so far, should not have walked home unaided. But the shepherd was so happy that he lifted up the sheep and bore it back triumphantly. A sheep is no mean weight, but the shepherd carried it willingly, and then called his neighbours to rejoice with him. This is not a picture of a God who grudgingly receives back a repentant sinner and then hands him a list of rules to keep, but of a God who is overwhelmed with joy so that all heaven rejoices with him. Not all of us will have the experience of losing a sheep, or even a Bedlington Terrier, but we all know the frustration of mislaying some item in the house and searching desperately. We've also experienced the relief when the item is found. It might only be a trivial item, a sock, a key, a pencil, or it could be something of real importance, a passport, a proof of purchase, a vehicle logbook. Either way, we really want to find it. In his second parable, Jesus told the story of the lost coin. It was just a reiteration of the lost sheep parable, really, in order to hammer home the message. And if, like many of us, a lost sheep was not in the experience of the hearers, this story most likely would resonate with all of them, but especially the female listeners. The woman in the parable loses one of 10 silver coins, probably one of the coins representing her dowry, and so of considerable significance. She searched exhaustively, taking a broom and sweeping the whole floor, holding a lamp up high to scan every dark corner. Like the shepherd, once she had found the coin, she called in her neighbours to rejoice with her. And Jesus concludes that there is the same rejoicing in heaven, in the presence of the angels, when even one sinner returns to Christ. The concept of a God who seeks and finds us when we have wandered far from the path is wonderful and humbling. In his first letter to Timothy, Paul speaks of this gracious God who had sought him even when he was a blasphemer, a persecutor of Christians, and a violent man. One doesn't go much further astray than that. He speaks of abundant grace being poured out upon him, because Jesus came to save sinners, not to seek people who were already righteous, because no one like that exists. Paul ends this short passage with a doxology to the King, eternal, immortal, invisible, the only God. That is the God whom we can trust to seek us out, however far we may have fallen, however far we may have wandered. The God who sought the lost sheep and brought it home rejoicing.